The oldest Japanese battleships, well, let's just say capital ships for now, to fight in World War II were the four ships of the originally 27,500-ton Kongo class started in 1911. Following the Russo-Japanese War, Japan committed to continuing to have the most powerful navy in the Western Pacific. Given the economic realities, that meant a force centered around four new armored cruisers, soon redubbed battle cruisers, and four new battleships. Since the battle cruisers were smaller and thus cheaper, they were built first. Lacking the technical know-how to build such large and complex ships, Japan turned to the assumed leader in naval construction, England, with whom they had had an alliance since 1902. Specifically, the private firm of Vickers and designer George Thurston. Unhindered by the British Admiralty's restrictions, Vickers designed a truly world-beating battle cruiser design. Kongo was built in England, the last large ship built abroad, while the others were built in Japan. Speed was as good or better than any other battle cruiser at the time, 27 knots, using a massive number of boilers that were coal-fired. Remember, 1911. Armament, as completed, was also world-beating at the time, 14-inch guns, all on the center line. Being designed by the British, who had experience with high seas and high speeds, they had a forecastle deck which ran from the bow almost to turret 4. Since the secondary guns were built into this deck rather than below the main deck as in American battleships, they remained relatively dry at the expense of not carrying as many of them. Being battle cruisers, armor was relatively light, especially on the sides, and of the then standard incremental type to reach the desired speed. For anyone not familiar with the battlecruiser concept, let's take a brief moment to explain this. Battlecruisers were not intended to fight battleships or even other battle cruisers. Instead, they were meant to use their cruiser speed and battleship armament to run down and overwhelm an enemy's commerce raiding or fleet scouting cruisers. As such, their armor only had to be sufficient to protect them against the relatively light 6 to 9 inch guns on cruisers, especially on the sides, since at the time it was still assumed that battles would take place at close ranges with flat trajectories. If they did run into an enemy's battleships, they would use their speed to deny battle, or, ideally, lure the enemy's battleships into their own battle fleet, as later happened at Jutland. Following the signing of the Washington Treaty in the mid to late 20s, as with many ships in many navies, they were heavily modified and redubbed battleships. The treaty had ceased the construction of most new ships and called for the scrapping of many older ones. As a result, again as in other navies, existing ships were as heavily modified as possible with World War I lessons in mind to get the most out of them. In Hiei's case, the 1930 treaty required she be reduced to a training ship. With Japan's withdrawal from the treaties in the mid-30s, they were modified yet again. Hiei was brought back to the standard of her sisters, and all were modified. They were by far the most active. This was partly because, even though eventually re-rated battleships, they were still in truth battle cruisers, and as such weren't held in reserve for Japan's planned Great Decisive Battle. More on that later. They were considered expendable. The other reason was because at first they were the only battleships fast enough to keep up with the carriers. Once the Guadalcanal campaign started, combined with being expendable, they were the only ones thought fast enough to run down the slot, bombard Henderson Field, then be out of range by daybreak. Kongo was started January 17, 1911 at Vickers in England and finished August 16, 1913. Hiei was started November 11, 1911 and finished August 4, 1914. Haruna was started March 16, 1912 and completed April 19, 1915. Kirishima was started March 17, 1912 and completed April 19, 1915. Main armament was 8 14-inch 45 caliber guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, with the rear pair being widely separated. Each turret weighed 655 tons. Original maximum elevation was 25 degrees with loading at 5 degrees. Maximum range was about 15 miles. Rate of fire was 2 rounds per minute per gun. Recoil was about 6 feet with a muzzle velocity of about 2,500 feet per second. 90 rounds per gun were usually carried, with each shell using 4 propellant bags. Each barrel was individually sleeved, meaning they could raise, lower, and fire separately of each other in the turret. By World War II, they carried 3 types of shells. The main one was a 1,485-pound armor-piercing round with a 24.5-pound bursting charge. The second was a 1,378-pound high-capacity bombardment round with a 65-pound bursting charge. The third was the 1,371-pound Sankaiden incendiary shrapnel anti-aircraft shotgun shell. Secondary armament was 16 6-inch 50 caliber guns, 8 on either side, midship, in casemates built into the forecastle deck just above the main deck. One pair was located below the overhang of turret 1. The second pair was below the overhang of turret 2. The third pair was below the bridge. The fourth pair was below the forward funnel. The fifth pair was below the second funnel. The sixth pair was below the third funnel. The seventh pair was below the overhang of turret 3. The eighth pair was below the barrels of turret 3. Each gun weighed 9 1/4 tons and fired a 100-pound shell with a 5 3/4-pound bursting charge. Original maximum elevation was 15 degrees with loading at 7 degrees. Maximum range was about 10 miles. Rate of fire was 6 rounds per minute per gun. Muzzle velocity was about 2,550 feet per second. 100 rounds per gun were usually carried, with each shell using 1 propellant bag. Turretary armament was a 3-inch 40 caliber gun. All 4 ships had 8 guns in single open mounts midship, 4 on either side. Kongo herself had 8 more, 2 on each turret. Finally, they also had 8 21-inch submerged torpedo tubes, 4 on either side. I'm not going to go over these because, like the 3-inch guns, they were long gone by World War II. For propulsion, they used a staggering 36 coal-fired boilers that ran from turret 2 all the way to turret 3, venting to 3 funnels, a glaring example of the thermal inefficiency and low pressure of the coal boilers at the time. These produced steam to 4 turbines between turrets 3 and 4 that produced 64,000 horsepower, each of which directly drove one of the 4 propellers. They had 1 rudder. Armor was of the standard incremental pattern, and as fitting a battlecruiser was only heavy enough, in theory, to protect them against enemy cruisers. Jutland, where the fallacy of the battlecruiser would be exposed, was still years away. The lower or main belt ran from turret 1 to turret 4, and coming up just above the water line was 8 inches thick, slimming down to 3 inches on either end beyond the turrets and as it neared the bottom. Above the main belt, and also running from turret 1 to turret 4, was the 6-inch upper or casemate belt, which came up to the deck, protecting the casemated guns. The armored deck was 1.5 inches thick at the ends, increasing to 2.25 inches over the vitals. The ends of the armored box were formed by bulkheads 5 to 6 inches thick forward of turret 1 and 6 to 8 inches thick aft of turret 4. 10 inches of armor protected the barbettes. The turrets had up to 9 inches of armor. 10 inches protected the conning tower. The boilers were arranged in 8 rooms separated by a longitudinal bulkhead. They were double-bottomed. Modernization of these ships, as with most interwar battleships, were heavy. Kongo had her 8 turret-mounted 3-inch guns removed in 1918, but a 7th was added in the mid-20s. Kongo and Hiei were given their thumbnail funnel caps in the early 20s in an effort to keep the massive amounts of smoke from blowing into the fire-controlled tripod. In the mid-20s, as longer and longer range gunnery was accepted, more and more levels were added to the forward tripod in an effort to get the spotters as high as possible. Maximum gun elevation was raised to 33 degrees. As the mid-20s turned into the late 20s, with new construction halted by the treaty and the obvious failure of the battlecruiser concept apparent, 3 were rebranded battleships and modernized. Bulges were added to give them something resembling a layered TDS to protect them against torpedoes. Doing so meant the loss of 2 torpedo tubes on either side. While they didn't yet have a catapult, room and equipment was added for 3 spotter float planes. Deck armor over the magazines and engines was increased to 4.7 inches, and barbette armor was increased to 11 inches. Finally, they were reboilered, though still coal-fired. Haruna received 16 new boilers, and Kongo and Kirishima 10. The new boilers allowed the removal of the number 1 funnel. Displacement rose to 29,330 tons, and speed dropped to 25 knots due to the increased weight. Hiei, on the other hand, was demilitarized. Under the terms of the 1930 treaty, she could only be kept by being converted into a training ship. The number 4 turret, all of the 6-inch secondary guns, and the remaining torpedo tubes were removed. Her armored belt was also removed. She was reduced to just 11 boilers and 2 funnels, cutting her speed to 18 knots. Displacement dropped to 18,000 tons. Note how much freeboard she has here and the lack of an armored belt. In the mid-30s, to the start of the war, with Japan's withdrawal from the treaties, all 4 began a second modernization, Hiei being brought back up to the standard of her sisters. Main armament elevation was increased to 43 degrees and secondary armament to 30 degrees. 4 twin 5-inch 40 caliber dual-purpose mounts were added midship, 2 on either side as replacements for the 3-inch guns. To support spotting at the new ranges, 3 had their superstructure built to the distinctive pagoda type, an arrangement that actually wasn't as heavy as it looks here. The 4th, Hiei, was fitted with a new tower structure as a test for the one meant for the soon-to-be-built Yamato class. The remaining 4 torpedo tubes were removed from the 3 that still had them. A catapult for 3 float planes was added to the port side between the numbers 3 and 4 turrets, though they had no hangar. The rear was lengthened 26 feet with a new stern to increase hydrodynamics. More armor was added to the barbettes and turret faces. Most importantly, the 4 turbines were replaced with 4 more powerful ones, and all of the boilers were replaced with 8 oil-burning ones, each in its own room, producing 136,000 horsepower, which increased speed to 30 knots. The increased room allowed a better subdivision of the boiler compartments. Displacement rose to over 32,000 tons. At the start of August 1942, Kongo received radar. Haruna received radar in October of the same year. In February and March of 1943, Kongo and Haruna were modified in an attempt to fix some of the weaknesses that led to the loss of their sisters. Concrete was added to increase protection around the steering gear. Emergency diesel fuel pumps were added. Subdivision was further increased. The numbers 7 and 8 6-inch guns were replaced with more AA. At the start of February of 1944, Kongo received 2 more twin 5-inch 40 caliber mounts, 1 on either side midship, at the expense of 6-inch guns 1, 2, 11, and 12. Of course, the number of light and medium anti-aircraft guns spiraled upward throughout the war. Hiei and Kirishima escorted the Pearl Harbor attack force, returning to Japan on Christmas Eve, 1941. Still with the carriers, they left Japan in early January 1942 and covered the invasion of Rabaul in the middle of the month. At the start of February, they sailed from Truk in an attempt to catch the American carriers that had raided the Gilberts and Marshalls, but were too far away. Kongo and Haruna, meanwhile, supported the invasion of Malaya. Escorted by cruisers and destroyers, they hunted for Force Z when it was spotted, but were unable to engage before the 2 British capital ships were sunk by aircraft. After covering the rest of the landings along the Malay Peninsula, Kongo and Haruna returned to Cameron Bay before departing on December 20th to cover the invasion of Luzon, returning on the 24th. Most of January and February was spent covering the invasion of the East Indies. In late February, Kongo and Haruna hooked up with Kido Butai, which included their sisters, and the whole force spent most of late February and March south of Java supporting the invasion of that island. While south of Java on March 1st, Kido Butai spotted the lone destroyer Edsel. Between 4 and 5:30 p.m., Hiei and Kirishima, along with the cruisers Tone, Chikuma, and several aircraft from Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, pounded the hapless destroyer down. In the first half of April, all four escorted the carriers into the Indian Ocean for the raid on Ceylon before returning to Japan near the end of the month to prepare for the Battle of Midway. During the battle,
Kongo and Hiei were part of the main body, while Haruna and Kirishima escorted the carriers. With the battle clearly lost on the 6th, Kongo and Hiei were ordered north to support the Aleutians' invasion force, but no battle developed there, so they eventually returned to Japan. Following the major fleet reorganization after Midway, Hiei and Kirishima headed to the Solomons with Shokaku and Zuikaku to oppose the American invasion of Guadalcanal in mid-August. Upon arrival, they escorted the carriers during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In mid-September, Kongo and Haruna finally arrived in the Solomons and took part in the 12th-13th overnight shelling of Henderson Field, while the other two screened the carriers supporting the bombardment. On the 26th, all four took part in the Battle of Santa Cruz. Kongo and Haruna screened Junio as she sailed east of the northern Solomons during the first and second naval battles of Guadalcanal. Hiei and Kirishima, meanwhile, both took part in the overnight first naval battle of Guadalcanal. Kirishima escaped any major damage at the first battle, but Hiei wasn't as lucky. Despite heavily damaging several ships with her 14-inch guns, she was hit repeatedly. The most obvious damage was the pounding her superstructure took. Her main and secondary gun directors were knocked out, and many of the senior officers on her bridges were either killed or wounded as the tower burned. More serious, though, was an 8-inch shell which hit her steering gear, jamming her rudder. Despite Kirishima trying to tow her, by the time dawn came, the damaged Hiei was still within range of American aircraft, circling and only able to make 5 knots. Even though aircraft from Junio and Rubal tried to intercept them, American aircraft eventually put 1 bomb and 4 torpedoes into the crippled Hiei, causing her to list heavily, trim down by the stern, and go dead in the water. With salvage efforts hopeless, the stricken battlecruiser was finally scuttled November 13, 1942, at 7:30 p.m. Kirishima, in the meantime, spent the 13th and 14th heading north, picking up reinforcements detached from Junio's escorts, and then heading south again, expecting to bombard Guadalcanal on the night of the 14th-15th in support of the troop ships heading for the island. Instead, her force ran into Admiral Willis Lee's waiting Task Force 64. At the overnight Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Kirishima started strong by hitting South Dakota, but soon found herself in the crosshairs of Washington's radar-directed guns. Hit by an estimated 20 16-inch and nearly as many 5-inch shells, Kirishima's archaic incremental battle cruiser scale protection was totally overwhelmed. Retreating northwest from Iron Bottom Sound, her rear turrets were out of action. Her forward magazines were flooded to prevent explosions. Fires were spreading throughout the ship and on the deck. The steering compartment was flooded, with the rudder jammed to starboard, making her unnavigable. Finally, she was listing and down by the stern. Obviously unsalvageable by daybreak, abandoned ship had already started when at 3:25 a.m. on November 15, 1942, she capsized and sunk, coming to rest upside down. In late January of 1943, Kongo and Haruna sailed to support the evacuation of Guadalcanal, and then sailed for Japan for refit, returning again to Truk at the start of April. In mid-May of 1943, they sailed as part of the massive force to oppose the liberation of Attu, but the island fell before they could arrive, so after spending some time in home waters, they finally returned to Truk in late June 1943. In late October 1943, they sailed as part of the force attempting to intercept the American carriers raiding Wake, but couldn't make contact, so they returned to Truk. In mid-December 1943, they returned to Japan. At the start of March of 1944, they left Japan for the East Indies. In mid-June of 1944, they departed the East Indies with most of the fleet and took part in the disastrous Battle of the Philippine Sea. During the American counter-strike, Haruna took one bomb hit on her port quarter and one on the roof of Turret 4. More serious were two near misses that acted like mine hits, causing minor flooding. Both returned to Japan near the end of the month, where Haruna was repaired. In mid-July 1944, Kongo departed Japan for the East Indies, never to return. A month later, the now repaired Haruna joined her. On October 22, 1944, they set off for the Battle of Leyte Gulf as part of Center Force. On the 25th, both were part of the wild Battle of Samar. Despite being strafed, Kongo hit Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay, contributing to all three sinking. While retiring north back toward the San Bernardino Strait, Center Force was attacked by planes from the approaching American carriers. Kongo suffered 5 near misses. One bent both starboard propellers. Another contaminated some fuel tanks. By the end of the month, both were back in port in the East Indies. In mid-November, Kongo departed with most of the fleet's damaged ships in an attempt to return to Japan for repairs. While passing through the Formosa Strait at 3 a.m. on November 21, 1944, Kongo was hit portside by 2 torpedoes fired from the submarine Sea Lion. One hit midship, flooding the numbers 6 and 8 boiler rooms. The second hit well forward, flooding the anchor's chain storage. With a slight list at first, the damage appeared minor, so she continued on at 16 knots and resumed zigzagging. This was a catastrophic mistake. Eventually, the flowing of the water ripped more and more compartments opening, increasing the list and decreasing her speed. Now listing 15 degrees and down to 10 knots, at 4:40 a.m., Kongo changed course and headed toward Formosa for emergency repairs. It was too late. At 5:20 a.m., she went dead in the water and the abandoned ship was given, even as the list increased to 45 degrees. Only 4 minutes later, at 5:24 a.m., her forward magazine exploded and she sunk, taking most of her crew with her. Haruna, in the meantime, remained in the East Indies until November 22nd, when she grounded. The damage was bad enough to force her back to Japan for repairs, finally arriving in mid-December. By the start of January 1945, her damage was partially repaired, but with the fuel shortages that caused the war worse than ever and virtually no air cover, she was essentially reduced to a floating anti-aircraft platform. On March 19, 1945, the anchored fleet was attacked by American carrier aircraft, Haruna being hit by one bomb that caused minor damage. On April 2nd, she hit a mine, causing minor flooding. On June 22nd, a bomber raid put one bomb on her quarterdeck and 2 near misses that caused more minor flooding. On July 24th, she was again attacked in port by carrier aircraft, one bomb hitting her port aft that opened a gash in her hull. 4 days later, on the 28th, she was attacked by carrier and bomber aircraft. By 4:15 p.m. that day, she had succumbed to the cumulative hits and finally sunk pierside. Her wreckage was finally refloated and scrapped in 1946.